So if everybody could sign in, that would be helpful.
Just take that and pass it around.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to see
Yeah.
before our guests begin speaking, if anybody had anything they wanted to add. I did email the minutes, if there's any changes we needed to make. Cindy emailed a new matrix. Did she email it to you? Okay, I have it, so I'll forward that on to everybody else. She emailed it to me this morning. Okay. If the minutes are okay, you can just email me tomorrow, and then I'll have to add them to the website.
Yes.
Tonight we have a special guest, Jannette Barth, and she's going to speak about, we've been reviewing the economics of gas drilling and how it will affect our town. Brad Walrod suggested that we have you come talk to us about some of the issues that we were looking into. And Jannette's going to start with a presentation about her background first.
Just a few words, yes.
Okay.
I'm a PhD economist. I've been doing economic analysis and developing economic models for over 35 years. I used to be the chief economist of the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and I've been a consultant for many years as well. I have been working on regional economic models since 1974, and I've worked in many, many different industries. Perhaps one of the most significant projects that might interest all of you is that I was retained to estimate the economic impact on the metropolitan area of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. That was a major job. So how did I get into fracking? I have a vacation home in Delaware County, and a bunch of my neighbors started talking about fracking about 4 years ago, and they were concerned about environmental impacts. But everybody felt it would be great for the economy, and then I started seeing some of the economic impact studies that had been done. So I thought, well, I'm an economist, I've done economic impact studies myself, let me start reading these. So I read a couple of them, and I frankly was appalled. The studies that claim there will be a great positive economic benefit to this region have been funded by the gas industry. And when I started looking at independent research, I found that independent and peer-reviewed research reaches vastly different conclusions than these industry-funded studies have reached. So I wrote a paper, the first paper I wrote on it, I forget what the title was, but basically it was about many unanswered questions of the economic impact of shale gas development in the Marcellus Shale. That paper got sent around a lot, and that's how I got into it. People started asking me to give talks, and then when each new paper came out, either gas industry funded or not, I would critique them. I probably have not critiqued every study, but I certainly have critiqued a lot of them. And that's how I got into this. And then I've been called to testify in Albany a number of times. I've been interviewed on radio, on television about fracking, and that's how I got into it. So, any questions about my background? Okay. I think Brad, when he contacted me, had asked me to speak for about, just a few minutes, an introduction to the economic impact of shale gas development, and then open it up for questions, because he said it would be a conversation tonight.
That's
so
up to the commission if
that
that's...
works for you.
Questions that we don't give on the matrix.
May I,
So let me,
can
yes.
I make a suggestion? We missed filming you when you were just beginning to talk
No,
about
I got
the doctorate and everything. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay. So certainly we all want to find a way to lower unemployment rates and to increase the number of jobs in this area. And we all want to be able to find ways to help the economy generally up here. Many people truly want to believe the industry claims that there's going to be a great economic benefit to the Marcellus region if we let them come in here and develop our area as a shale gas region. The fact is, having looked at a number of different independent pieces of research and also having critiqued the industry-funded studies, the fact is that it is quite possible and actually quite likely that the net economic impact may be negative for the region if everything were taken into account. Now, sadly, you know, I'm sure you're all aware the DEC had released their revised draft SGEIS, and now they have very recently released draft regulations for fracking in New York. Sadly, these draft regulations rely on the economic impact assessment that was done for the SGEIS. And I and other economists had severely criticized how that assessment was done. In fact, that assessment that was done for the SGEIS is entirely inadequate and it's frankly unacceptable. They've exaggerated the benefits and they've ignored many costs. And it seems now that we see the proposed regulations. The proposed regulations make frequent reference to the economic assessment in the SGEIS. So they're using that without it having been improved or corrected. So none of the criticisms that were submitted in comments by independent economists have been taken into account. They've also ignored peer-reviewed research in both the SGEIS and in the revised regs. So not only have they exaggerated benefits, but they have ignored many costs. And even if you read the proposed regs, you'll see that they list a number of costs, but they don't estimate them. In fact, in some cases, they say, oh, it's impossible to estimate them. Now, my feeling is a state department, especially the DEC, that is tasked with the responsibility of determining if this is a good idea for us, should be required to at least make an educated guess of what the costs are going to be. They refuse to do that, and yet they make statements saying that the revenues are going to more than make up for the costs. There's no way they know that because they haven't actually done the work to estimate what the costs will be. And there may be very large costs for small communities. Even the revised regs, the proposed regs, even those list a number of costs to local communities. How many of you have read any parts of the proposed regs? Okay, so most of you. So you know what I'm talking about.
Do you have a copy of that?
The revised regs?
Yeah.
Not to distribute. Do you have?
Oh, they're huge.
Yeah.
But you can go to New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They're hard to get to. It's not an easy site to navigate.
Can
but
you send a link to the Fracking Commission's email?
yeah,
Absolutely. Do it that way.
Yeah, I have it.
you have it. Okay. But there are several pieces to it. It's not all of one piece. So you have to kind of look through because
There are about a half
60
a dozen pieces.
Right,
yeah.
and there were 60,000 plus comments, and there has been negligible response to the comments, but there's been some. So there are some addenda, and some of it's indexed, but you'll find it. It's not easy.
Overwhelming.
It is. It's a lot to read. I read the parts that were significant to economic impact. I know others have focused on their areas of interest as well. But let me share with you some of the findings from peer-reviewed research. And you'll notice how different these are than the conclusions you've seen the industry state and even our own DEC state. First, job growth is overstated in studies sponsored by the gas industry. That's not my conclusion alone. Professor Kinnaman from Bucknell did a peer-reviewed paper that concluded that. Also, recent peer-reviewed research in other states have found only small positive impacts on income, employment, and population as a result of oil and gas extraction. And a piece that focused on the short-term impact found only modest increases in employment, wage, and salary income. Here's a quote from another study that was done by Resources for the Future together with Duke University. The risk of groundwater contamination from natural gas extraction leads to a large and significant reduction in house prices, and these reductions offset any gains to owners from lease payments or improved local economic conditions. There was some research in Pennsylvania that concluded most local governments being affected by shale gas development are not seeing more tax revenue as a result, while 26% of the local governments indicated that related costs had increased. Here's a quote from a study in Sociological Inquiry. The areas of the United States having the highest levels of long-term poverty tend to be found in the very places that were once the site of thriving extractive industries. And a very recent report from West Virginia, also in the Marcellus Shale, shows that the expected game-changing gas boom has not materialized there. In 4 years of shale gas drilling, only 916 jobs were created in West Virginia. And the unemployment rate in the 4 core drilling counties has risen since drilling began, and their workforces have declined in size. These conclusions are very different than what we've heard from the DEC and from the industry-funded studies.
Is there a chance to get them more information on that Pennsylvania study especially?
I'll
'Cause
send it to you.
I think we compare ourselves a lot with Pennsylvania.
Now, may I send things directly to Brad and you can get them?
I'll give you my email.
Okay.
Okay.
And if you could give us those points that you just spoke about and where they came from,
Absolutely.
that would, the
What I will
references.
do is send you my, these are all in my comments that I submitted on the regs with the sources. So if you have that, these are from those sources that you provided, or most of them, but I can make sure you have all of them.
When you
Okay.
send that to the commission, could you copy it to Brad, because Brad has a number of people on a mailing list that you could, if you had it posted there, that it would be easier for the public to get it from
Sure.
yours.
And as a backup, if Craig misplaces it, I'll have a copy.
And we'll have the
we
film
won't
at
have to
some
bother you.
point.
Yeah.
Okay,
that
I don't
would-
mind being bothered. Okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
We had some specific questions, and one of the questions was the shift of the workers to drilling jobs, and how does that impact the current businesses that are here when they leave? So, we have a lot of small businesses here, excavating companies, and, if their workers leave to the drilling jobs, what happens? Or is that even something that really is happening?
My understanding is it is happening. I personally went down to Pennsylvania and met with one of the commissioners down there, and he explained to me that that's happening in Pennsylvania, at least in his town, which was, what's that town in Bradford County?
Towanda?
Thank you, yes. So it's interesting you mentioned that, because that is an economists have a term for that. It's called crowding out. When you have a short-term boom happening, any industry comes into an area. If it's a big enough industry, it will be able to afford to pay higher wages than the existing smaller businesses that are here already. And so those workers will be attracted to go to that industry. Those businesses have to close. It is the nature of any industry that is characterized by a short-term boom followed by a long-term bust, and that's true of every extractive industry. So then the long-term bust comes, those small businesses are already gone. What happens in this particular industry is even worse, because they bring in workers from out of state, and they might build temporary housing. Maybe people will have developed even more permanent type housing, and then the long-term bust comes. Those workers go back to Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas, wherever they came from. The workers who were in the small businesses have no small business to go back to, and all of those buildings are empty, and you end up with kind of ghost towns. You end up, have you been through Appalachia, where coal mining used to happen in parts of West Virginia and Pennsylvania?
Mountaintop is brutal.
That's exactly what is characteristic of these industries. And the gas industry doesn't tell you this. And I'm really very sad to say that the DEC doesn't even mention long-term bust in their papers.
So that's actually true with almost any type of a mineral type of thing. Copper mines, gold mines, silver mines.
Extractive industries,
Exact-
if that resource is mostly used up, that's it. So that's why it happens, because it's not a manufacturing industry that keeps manufacturing. That's why it happens with extractive industries, right?
Now, how do you reconcile, I mean, you read Forbes and, Texas and North Dakota's booming and,
Yeah.
you don't see that happening in New York State, though. I mean,
You mean, well, New York State hasn't started fracking yet.
I know,
And
but
you'll definitely.
you don't see that in a crystal ball.
Oh, me?
Yeah,
Oh,
boom, that you
oh,
see.
don't get me wrong. There will be short-term jobs. There will definitely be short-term jobs. But we do not know how long that short-term boom is going to last. And I think we should be thinking about the long-term as well. I do believe that if you could control the pace and scale of drilling, maybe it would help prevent.
Well, we live on we have to, I'm being a devil's advocate here, because
Yeah.
I'm really opposed to most of this stuff. I mean, I'm looking at a bigger picture that says don't do any carbon extraction at all, but I'm trying to see it as another person like Earl and a lot of people in the county or township would see it. And they're saying, go for it, it's there, it's ours, it's on our land, we can do with our land what we want and all that.
Just
So what
remember, in places like North Dakota and the shale there, if you read all these articles about North Dakota, in Williston, for example, Williston, North Dakota having this boom now, many of those workers are from out of state, many of them, and they have lots of man camps. And I remember hearing a presentation by Jill Morrison of the Powder River Basin Commission in Wyoming, talking about the drilling out there and how it really negatively impacted many of the communities. Even though there was a boom in a lot of ways, a lot of outside people come in, and with it comes increasing crime. Crime rates increased between 10 and 15% in that area in the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. Small communities had to build new and larger jails, another expense that isn't discussed. They had a big increase in drug problems, especially related to methamphetamines. So the community impacts you have to think about, even in a place like North Dakota, where they're having this boom. Let's step back and think about all the things that can happen.
Good way to look at this thing, the way I look at it a little bit, is like, look at a gold rush.
Such a gold
Brings
rush.
lots of people in, there's a big boom for a while, but the people that make money are the people that maybe sell goods, some of the, stores that sell supplies to these, the miners, and, a few other things they have going on, but they're really for the long, and then it disappears. I mean, then all of a sudden the
Well,
boom's
right.
over and they leave.
The gas industry will make money, and there are some landowners that will make money.
Well, there's a question about that too, there's a lot of flipping going on with this.
There
You know,
is,
there's a-
that's true, that's a whole nother,
Yeah.
that's a whole
Whole
nother side of
aspect
it.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole nother aspect of it. But it does seem that the financial analysts, and I'm not a financial analyst, but the financial analysts seem to be saying that that the big players, the majors, are sitting back waiting for the smaller companies to fail, and then later hoping for increase in gas prices will step in and it will be taken over by the major oil and gas companies. That's sort of what the prognosis is from those financial analysts. Again, I'm not a financial analyst.
I just read one of Brad's letters on a thing where they're having difficulties now with the leases. They're leading land on the contractors. Apparently, it's the drillers. I didn't zero in on this enough. They didn't actually say what companies are leading the properties, but it appears to me it's probably the drilling companies leading it for money from the gas company owners. That's what it appears to be. And there's quite a bit of that going on.
I didn't quite.
There's liens on the property. See, the drillers are going in to drill.
L-E-I-N.
Now, all of a sudden, they have $15 million bill here that they've built to the drilling owners, the company owners. Chesapeake is one of the ones that's named.
Chesapeake is the
That's what
main
we
one, I
have,
think.
right.
Are the other
Yeah.
Now,
companies?
they're not, they're
I thought it was
apparently-
only Chesapeake at this point.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
But they're not being paid for the drilling. They got a $50 million bill there.
Because the
So-
price of the gas has gone down so.
Well, I don't know if that's the case, but I mean, what I'm saying is they're,
Written in that article you gave us last week,
Property owners aren't being paid.
that they're actually slowing right down on the drilling, just stop the drilling, so the price of gas will come back up.
Well, what's happening too is, if there's, you know, they're called mechanics liens.
right.
And if the gas industry is not paying their contractors, those contractors are putting a mechanics lien on the property. And the way those liens are put in to the system are through the block and lot on the tax records. So it blemishes
Well, sure,
any,
the
any,
homeowner
any
can't-
home,
If he wants to sell his property.
any
he can't
homeowner's
do it.
property,
There's a
exactly,
lien against it.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Now, that brings up a
Now,
whole,
this
another
is two-
issue.
This is two different issues here, one is subsurface and the other surface you're talking about now. Now,
Right.
Subsurface is a whole different bunch of rights versus surface
Well,
properties.
Earl, that's what I'm saying, what she's saying is they're all combined now, because you can't separate the two. Even though they're drilling, even though they're taking the minerals out from under it, out from under the ground, they're leaning the property. Now,
The
the
entire
property's,
property.
the property's the property, you can't just lean under the property, you lean the property.
It's
And that's
because
the
of the
problem,
way
these
that,
people wanna sell, if they wanna sell the
it's
property.
because
they-
of how the tax
they're
records
leaning.
work, right? Because it's, even though
It's
clearly
like
you're
selling
right,
property without a
it's,
house.
it's a lien on the lease, you're right, on the gas lease,
Right.
but the way tax records work, it's assigned to the block and lot. So as I say, it's a blemish, you know, on anybody trying to sell the surface rights. It would probably get cleared up, but I'm not a lawyer either. I'm neither a financial analyst nor a lawyer. But lawyers have indicated that this could be a blemish on the property.
Against the lease of the pad itself,
Right.
but not on the subsurface.
Can't
But
sell-
it
they
appears
can't
as
separate.
it appears as a lien in the records
Yeah.
because it's
You
assigned
can't-
to the
you
lot
can't
and block
separate it.
number in the
It's
What
tax
separate.
separates is two different titles when you go to courthouse. Two separate titles when you go to courthouse if you wanna,
No, there
if
isn't.
somebody is leasing subsurface.
No, we do closings all the time, that's right. Your
That's-
title is your title, it's your
right.
deed.
That's right.
It's the guarantee of your and there are many,
That's what I
many things in
understand as well.
deeds, and you own to the center of the earth. The gas company may be separating it, but the legal ownership is not separated in any way.
That's my
You still
understanding.
own the whole thing, into
Right.
infinity, into
They're
space,
only,
and the
they're
center of
only
the earth.
entitled to the minerals underneath. Okay, well, whatever.
This brings up a whole nother point that we should talk about, and that's property values, because that's very important to
Yeah.
small communities. Property values, if they go down, of course, property tax revenues will decline as well. And there have been studies showing that property values decline. Oh, one thing I just read to you, property values decline by about, I think the number was about 24%, according to one study, if the home or the property has groundwater as their water supply. Interestingly enough, they said if the water's piped in and is not groundwater, the property values tend to increase by 11%. So that's an interesting thing that should be studied. The DEC doesn't even look into these questions. Another thing we found is that in Texas, in Wise County, which is really in the center of the Barnett Shale, the Wise County Central Real Estate Appraisal Board has valued properties that have a gas well, have dropped the value by as much as 75% if the property has a gas well. That's a huge decline. Similar study in Colorado showed 22% drop in Colorado. So these numbers are wide, but it's interesting that one of the studies showed 24% heat, 24%, and then I think it was the Resources for the Future study, and the Colorado study showed 22%. So that's an interesting drop. I'll get to your question in a second, but a couple more things on property values. There have been some banks that have suggested that they may not give mortgages on a property that has a gas well, and we've seen insurance companies, especially nationwide, state that they will not issue a homeowner's policy because the risk is to high, and therefore the policy would be too expensive. So if your water becomes contaminated, or if a buyer can't get a mortgage, or if a buyer can't get a homeowner's insurance policy, to me that sounds like property values are going to decline, because you can't sell your house, you'll have to drop the price a lot to sell it, and then of course property tax revenues decline. So we've got to think more about what will be the impact on these small communities with regard to property values and property taxes. There was a question here first.
No, you got it.
Okay,
And that's in spite of the royalty monthly income coming in.
that's right.
The costs are just not itemized enough, and they do tend to overwhelm. But it's in spite of
Right,
the royalty payments that people are just gloating about.
right.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Now, you would be unable to sell your property for the duration of the lease that you've signed with the gas company, is that correct? If there's a
Maybe
mechanics
somebody
lien,
wants to buy
You
it.
can sell it.
you can sell it.
You're
can
allowed to
As
sell
long
sell
as
it.
there's no
If it-
mechanics lien
If it was
against it.
if it was interesting to someone, she's saying, you know, it would be possibly less interesting to buyers, and I can personally comment on that, but I'll
I
let you.
think the thing that
keep
you're
the
a little
floor.
confused about is,
I'm a
if there's a
realtor.
lien on
Please
the property.
comment on it. I'd like to
If there's
know.
a lien, mechanical's lien on a property, it becomes more difficult.
The lien will have to be
Okay.
satisfied in order
Before-
for the deed
Right.
Okay.
and title to clear to the next buyer.
But
But-
that's
which
satisfied.
would-
But with a lease in place, you can still sell your property
Yes.
for the club.
If the new buyer want, you know,
Yeah,
either,
tell them there's.
And you would transfer
Wants
the
to-
lease to the
Tell
new
them there's
buyer?
gold in these hills, don't run.
The lease transfers to the new buyer?
that would be your choice.
Depends on what the original lease says. There's no black and white on that. It really depends on what the original lease
Some
says.
people are keeping the
If
gas
that's the
rights.
case, then how are they selling property without releasing the royalties, or without releasing the mineral rights?
Well, what's
If
happened
it's
on,
not two separate entities.
it's not to, I mean, I just came from a closing at Bill Jealous' an hour ago. You have one title and one deed, and deeds can have restrictions, they can have leases, they can have all
And they can
kinds
be
of things
split.
on them. That's right. Somehow the gas companies have allowed, America has allowed the separation of these two, even though the owner owns 100%, you are somehow allowed to lease out just the mineral or gas rights, subsurface. I really don't know how that got into law, and a lot of it started, I think, with even airplanes. They're all flying through your space, but they got permission to do that at a certain altitude through the FAA when that became, what, in the 50s, 60s? I don't know when it happened. But that's your space too, but they got the rights to do that and you don't get paid for
Because
it.
there's some parks where aircraft aren't allowed. There's some parks in
yes.
Durango, as a matter of fact.
That's from the government owns that.
Right, but going back to the lien question. I mean, my understanding is that the difficulty is when you have the lien on the property. That means that in order to satisfy it, a mechanic's lien or any other kind of lien, a bank lien, whatever, it has to be satisfied. Now, if Chesapeake et al. Have taken it upon themselves to ascribe that lien to you as property owner, in order to sell the property, you're going to have to fight that battle first in court to say, okay, from whom does satisfaction come? Is it the property owner? Is it, again, who knows how that would all play out?
Right, it would depend on your lease. Are you protected or not?
Well,
Exactly.
yeah, but it would also, it might even make it to the state Supreme Court. That's a serious question of who has incurred that financial liability. Have they done it on your behalf? I mean, there's serious questions about the lien.
May I ask a question? If you're a realtor, do you have any insights on what the attitude is now when buyers are coming to Sullivan County?
Well,
and-
I can tell you, without mentioning names or real personal information, that yes, personally I have lost 2 transactions, 2 gas leases. And in case number 1, it was Silas Tompkins Road, so it's Hancock Township. And The buyer was perfectly aware of the gas lease. I was only the selling agent, not the listing agent, but I have a copy of the 17-page lease, and the buyer was fully aware. He wanted the property for recreation, and he said, that's okay, what's gonna happen? I said, well, you know, it's 25 acres, they may or may not solicit to put a well there, but you would get money, blah, 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 how it works, you know, if they're willing to transfer the lease. So he was fully aware, negotiated the offer, came to terms, the contract was sent out by the seller, who had a gas lease, and when the buyer's attorney got it, he said, absolutely not, can I tell you to enter forth in something like this, why would you want to do this? And so that went south there, even though he was perfectly willing, but when your attorney comes along and says, you don't want any part of this, and there were several specific reasons in the lease that he labeled. And the next one happens to be, it's Town of Fremont? Yeah, that's still Fremont, right, near Hill Road. And same thing, that was in September, the first one was July, and negotiated an offer on a second home on near Hill in the town of Fremont, even had their home inspection, contracts were out, and the New York Times, and I have this written in emails as well, both of them, the New York Times did their article specifying Hancock and Long Eddy back in September, and they immediately panicked, and they were through another broker. It wasn't my fault. I was this time the listing agent, and there was a selling broker, and she's like, oh, they saw the article, they want to do more due diligence. Sent them off to Delhi to research the leases in the area that they were buying, and they walked away and said they were going to go somewhere else, and you know, they already had an inspection, negotiated, and contracts were out.
Has it been an attraction for buyers?
We haven't had anybody, I haven't personally, I couldn't say about anyone else. Personally, I haven't had anybody asking for property with a lease. No, I haven't.
Or have you had people come and say, we'd like to buy, 1,000 acres because we want to,
No,
right?
no, contrary to popular belief,
That's what I suspected, right?
we haven't had any.
Thank you very much.
At a recent town board meeting here, I think it was August or September, there was a woman who testified during the public comment that she's a resident of the adjacent town of Calhoun, and she and her husband were looking for a place specifically in this town of Delaware, and that when the Roeder resolution was passed, which places the town, or states that the town is in favor of drilling, as soon as possible, that she and her husband told the realtors, no, we're not gonna look in the town of Delaware, we're gonna have to look someplace else. And I've talked to a couple of other realtors in the town. It's all kind of anecdotal, but this, what I've heard is more stories of people deciding not to buy or to suspend a search for property in this area, and have not heard from any of the realtors in the town that, there's a great demand for people coming in here, like you say, to buy up 1,000 acres because they think that drilling is imminent, or a good deal.
And I do want to correct that Near Hill is the town of Hancock. It's just off the Fremont line, it's town of Hancock, with a Long Eddy address.
Hey, Debbie.
Earl, have you heard of any interest, people coming in,
No.
interested in buying large parcels of land?
I would be interested to see how this school deal plays out as far as the mineral rights with there, if they buy additional property. I'd like to see how that goes. I mean, cause he's right on the gas line.
Now, while we're on taxes, would you like to make some comments about severance tax? How it affects that?
We don't have a severance tax in this state.
I know.
And could you explain how that operates?
The
And
me-
who is the beneficiary of a severance tax if the state legislature were to decide to impose one?
You know, I will talk a little bit about this, but I first want to make sure you're aware of a white paper that was done in Tompkins County. Do you know this paper? It was a very detailed paper about the ad valorem tax, and it also talked about severance taxes. So I recommend that paper to you.
Was it Tompkins County, what was the town? Owego or Otsego?
I think I have a copy of it with me.
I
but
think that was one of the early ones I sent to the commission.
I have-
Otsego, thank you.
It's called the White Paper, you can Google this and get it. White Paper on Taxation Issues Related to Gas Drilling. It was done February 12th, 2012. It was done by the Tompkins County Council of Governments, the Gas Drilling Task Force, Assessment and Land Valuation Subcommittee.
And does that explain the difference between ad valorem tax and the severance tax?
It sure does, and I can do a little bit of that as well.
That would be great, because at one of the commission meetings with the,
I straightened all that out, though. I got it.
yeah,
The ad valorem tax is kind of like a property tax. Basically, it's calculated, I've done a bunch of appraising in my past as well, and it actually uses an appraisal methodology called the income approach. And basically the ad valorem tax is based on sort of a discounted present value of the amount of the value of all of
Your
the...
property taxes as well.
Right, but this applies to gas drilling production and gas drilling equipment that's on a particular well pad, for example. And so the total value of that, using the income approach, is what is the basis of the ad valorem tax. And there's some problems with the ad valorem tax as it's done in New York now. And I think the two key things for this particular application, one is that it's based on a 5-year average, and you would not be able to impose that tax and collect that tax till at least about 2 or 3 years after drilling would start. And small communities would have costs immediately when drilling would start, but you wouldn't be having the revenue from the ad valorem tax. So that's a problem. And this Tompkins County paper is making recommendations as to how that could possibly be fixed. The severance tax, on the other hand, is a tax directly on the gas drillers when they remove gas from the earth. So it's a percentage of the value of the gas at that time. Now, in most states, I think there are only 2 gas drilling states without severance taxes right now, I believe. I think it's New York and Pennsylvania. And most of the states that have them, it all goes to the general fund in the state government. And I think that is probably how it would work here. But again, this white paper by Tompkins County has made recommendations that if we impose a severance tax, and they recommend a severance tax, but if we impose a severance tax, then we should also impose regulations that ensure that the money, or at least most of the money, is going to the communities that are impacted. One of the problems with, another big problem, going back to ad valorem for a minute, and because it relates to everything coming back to the community, you have to know that in this shale gas development situation, the communities with the gas wells will be impacted, but communities nearby those communities are also impacted with staging areas, man camps, traffic, what have you. But the ad valorem tax will only go to those communities with the wells. So if you had a severance tax created in such a way that it was collected as a percentage of the value of the gas coming out, and the state was sending it back to communities that are impacted, many more communities are impacted than just those with the gas wells. So we need more time, at a minimum, to figure out a proper tax legislation to make sure that New York State will get what they deserve from their valuable resource that's under here. And it is a valuable resource. But if something goes wrong, first of all, we want to get New York State and the impacted community should get money for it. The way the taxes are set up now, it's not going to work. You can tell from the DEC website, the Division of Minerals has data on tax revenues to local communities. And in 2009, on average, local governments got $600 per producing well in their area. $600 is pittance, and I don't think it's enough to pay the significant costs that could be incurred by small governments.
Another little issue here with the ad valorem tax is that they go by the quantity. And they have this meter set up to find that out. And guess who's reading the meters?
That's it. The industry reads the meters, and there's no validation process. So that's a whole other thing. It's another part of the whole tax thing has to be rethought carefully and redone before New York State allows this to happen, because we have to make sure we're getting money for this. Now, you know, we in New York State have a vast amount of wonderful water, more than a lot of other states. So if something happens to the water, then we don't have that as a resource going forward. Water is going to become more valuable worldwide, fresh, clean water. So if we wait on the gas, get it all right, get the taxes right, maybe even encourage them to use green chemicals, maybe we can benefit from the gas later and make more off of it at a time when we're not going to take a chance risking our other valuable resource, which is our fresh water. So why not wait? What's the hurry? That's what I've never understood. What's the hurry? We have it. It's not going to go anywhere. Yes.
My understanding was that Cuomo had put a 3% severance tax into the 2011-2012 proposed budget back in 2011. It's like a 3%. At a time when Texas is like 7 or 8.
7. I mean, Alaska's like 20-something, 25.
So
So most of them are around 7%. They vary, yeah. And some of them are very complicated, too. There's two different percentages for different types of things.
So what happened to that? Is that not in the budget for 2012, 2013?
I don't know the answer to that. Any politicos here? I don't know.
The other thing I wanted to ask was, I don't know why they don't have to pay for the water. And Chesapeake was actually fined some humongous amount of money at one point because they were defrauding their leaseholders. They were defrauding their lessors because of metering. You know, how much was actually coming out of the ground, what value was to the people who owned the property versus the value to Chesapeake, and you know, oops, we didn't measure it right. Big money.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we have procedures in place to monitor the industry, not only to make sure that they're doing things safely, but also that they're giving us the right information. You know what was interesting in these revised regs as well? One thing, the DEC even said that they felt that the costs
That's what we're here.
that would be incurred by the industry because of regulations that DEC is imposing, the industry claimed they were very high. And the DEC thought, oh, they're probably not that high. And they asked repeatedly for more information from the industry, and the industry refused to give them the information. They refused to give it to the DEC. So what's going to happen in the future when the industry stonewalls the DEC to get information on chemicals, get information on anything? It's a concern, so we have to be very careful. Yes?
Would you speak for a minute to the wastewater issues and radon in Marcellus?
Yeah, that's not as, well, I guess everything's an economic issue, but I'm an economist, but radon is apparently, the studies I've seen indicate that the gas for the Marcellus Shale has a high quantity of radon in it. And radon has a very long half-life. So if it's piped all the way to New York City, it still won't disappear, even to New York City, out of the Marcellus gas. So people in these big buildings and everywhere in between will be piping radon into their homes when they're using heating or cooking based on natural gas. And that's an economic issue for health reasons,
etc.
etc.
Your point about better technologies going forward. I mean, it should not be a rush rush at this point.
Right.
Because there are new filtration methods that are on just about coming out of the drawing boards, and different methods of all kinds of sponges and things that are just sort of lab things, but they will be incorporated someday into this, and with the price at some ridiculously low number, why not wait? You're sitting on it, make it,
Wait
Wait
for the
till it's
value
right.
to increase
wait till
too.
it's done right.
Absolutely.
Technology
And then the
is
price will
there,
go.
it's just, you know, it's like,
Because we know the price will go up, because if these, you know, let's talk about exports for a moment. A lot of the companies have applied to convert the liquid natural gas importing terminals around the country into exporting terminals. And there was recently a study done that I critiqued, so you can have that one too, on the impact that would have. We know if we start exporting our shale gas, price will go up. The global price for shale gas is much higher than the price here right now, so we'll be exposing our gas to the global market. That's only one factor. Also, we know that, like, the T. Boone Pickens plan is encouraging the use of natural gas in many transportation vehicles. That will increase the demand for natural gas. You increase the demand, price tends to go up. So here we have exports and increased demand for transportation. Now, we also know that because of recent regulations, new power plants cannot be coal-driven. They have to be natural gas. So that's going to increase the demand for natural gas dramatically. We also know that in big cities like New York City, Mayor Bloomberg has pushed for the large buildings there to convert their heating systems to natural gas. All of these increases in demand are going to increase the price. Let's wait till that price goes sky high before we take it out of New York, and let's really get a lot of money for it. And also maybe by then we know it'll be safe to do it. And we won't harm our water if it's safe to do it.
Tom had a
Yes.
question.
I'd like to take you back to the beginning of your comments. I've done some work on development projects in Latin America involving extractive industries.
Yes.
And what we found is this boom-bust cycle that you talked about. And overwhelmingly, the communities that went into extractive industries as a development spur ended up being impoverished and being worse off than areas that relied on diversified economic development using different. What we found is that extractive industries promote a monocultural pattern which undermines the possibility for any kind of diversified development in the future. But what I want to ask you is, it's a very difficult argument to make, specifically in our town here, when you want to weigh a quick short-term gain, and people are pretty desperate. They're looking for, some form of development, some form of money coming in. But how do you make the argument that you are actually better off avoiding that and relying on slow, systematic, gradual, diversified economic development, relying on tourism, agriculture, small arts and art forms and so forth, which will produce in the end a more steady, higher growth rate versus this quick boom and then you have a bust. But it's what I want to ask you is how do you make that argument to people? That you're actually better off doing a slow, gradual, diversified pattern as opposed to this quick boom thing. Do you have any?
That's a really excellent question. I wish I had a really good answer for that. But you raise a point. Economists call the resource curse. These countries, especially foreign countries, less
Nigeria,
developed countries,
South America.
where you were working, that's what happens. These areas are much worse off in the end. And there's a lot of economics literature on exactly this subject. There's less literature, but there is peer-reviewed economic literature on the resource curse in the United States. And it also confirms that there is, in fact, a resource curse in counties in the United States who have an abundance of natural resources, because the same thing happens in those counties compared to counties without it. One piece of research I did not read to you, but let me read this finding to you. There's a firm called Headwaters Economics, which is an independent, nonprofit economic consulting firm out west. They studied counties out west in connection with gas drilling, and they concluded that counties that were not focused on fossil fuel extraction experienced higher growth rates, more diverse economies, better educated populations, a smaller gap between high and low income households, and more retirement and investment income. It's exactly what you're saying. I think that what we can do for communities to make them aware is explain the resource curse, perhaps. It's kind of esoteric to some people, and it's hard to understand that. But I also think that if you can explain all the costs that will be incurred by the communities, maybe if you do a cost-benefit analysis, which the DEC should have done for each community, and they haven't. If you did a cost-benefit analysis for your own community, you might see that it may not be worth it, especially now. So that's all I can say. I wish I had a really good answer.
As a consultant, can you give us an idea? This is a town of about 2,700 people. To do a specific cost-benefit analysis for a town, if the town board were interested in doing something like that, what would something like that cost the community?
You know, so many
To
people.
do a good job of that.
So many people have asked me if I would do something like this. The problem with it is that it would require a team of experts with different areas of expertise,
Yeah.
because we would need to do analysis of so many different things to do a proper job.
Yeah.
I think the state should be paying for that type of a study and get a proper team of people to do it. I can't give you a price right here because think about this. Somebody mentioned, and I often mention in my talks, the fact that the DEC has ignored the very real possibility that there'll be declines in other industries that are not compatible with an industrial landscape, industries that are not compatible with either the real or perceived contamination of water, air, or land. And these industries obviously include, I think you mentioned them, tourism, agriculture, organic farming, hunting, fishing, winemaking, beer making, and other outdoor recreation.
And healthcare is a big thing in Sullivan County, healthcare.
Right. Well,
People come here for healthcare.
healthcare the healthcare industry may improve because there'll be so many accidents. You know?
Oh, monetarily improved. Okay.
But these other industries are likely to suffer, frankly, and you don't see them adjusting the employment numbers that they're coming up with for these drops in employment. And I'm not even talking about the crowding out thing that you mentioned, because those are small businesses that have to die because the wage rates are higher elsewhere. This is just the industry's decline because tourists aren't going to come up, hunters don't want to come up and get a deer that may have had the water that has fracking fluid in it. You know, I mean, that's just an example. But none of these things have been accounted for. And to account for those sorts of things would require surveys of sort of tourists elsewhere who come here to see how would they drop off. We know we have an anecdotal comment from the biggest food co-op in New York City that says if fracking happens upstate, they're not going to buy fruits or vegetables from this area anymore.
But they
And-
get the water from you, though.
Pardon?
They get the water from
I
you.
know. What are they going to do? Right?
Well,
Although the
and
watershed is apparently.
if we have the compressor in Hancock, I mean, air currents don't hang out just at Hancock. I mean, they're going to be getting on will-o-wisps, food, you know.
Yeah, the prevailing
Who
winds.
would buy that? But I want to go back to the question I was asking before about water. I don't understand, if you own property in the village of Calhoun, why you have to buy your water. But in terms of resource management, in all the towns and all the counties, especially in the rural areas, it's like we're in this indentured relationship to New York State. We all know that. Why are we giving our water away free to any industry? I mean, have economic studies ever been done on that? I mean, at 1 million gallons per well, per drill, per day, with upwards of 12 wellheads per, pad, that's a ton of water.
Well, that's
That
one
if
of
I
the
paid
that's
for
one
it
of the
coming out
things
of
they
my
have
faucet, it's gonna cost me.
They'll have to get to the bottom of that, and probably the thing to do is maybe have a big carbon tax, you know what I mean, just nail them right.
Now, I'm
there.
asking the economist, because I wanna know whether or not studies have been done about what is the value of that water? What is its intrinsic value? What is its real value? What is its value in a sale? What's its value in it being clean when it comes out of my tap? What's its value to the organic farmer? And what's its real value to the fracking company?
I have not done research on water, but there are economists that do, and there are studies out there that information probably is available. I don't think it's been done for the fracking industry up here, because I'm sure I would have seen it. But I think it should be done. I think you raise a really good point.
Yeah. We have such a vast amount of water that we don't think in those terms too much, but there'll come a day when we will.
But we don't
We'll
have,
be selling it internationally.
Yeah, 90.
I sit in town board
$90 a
meetings and
gallon
I hear
or
all
more.
the time about how the towns are suffering. We don't have revenue. New York State doesn't have revenue. The county is dying. We don't have revenue. But we're gonna give our water away.
Well,
A million gallons a day per drill.
I don't know about where you're getting it about it being given away. I know when the DRBC, it was something like, what they were considering was 8 cents per 1,000 gallons or something like that. So I don't know where this is coming from about it being free. I think that the drilling companies would have to pay so much, to whoever they get their water from. I have not heard anything about the water being free.
Right. Well,
Okay,
check out.
getting back to
And I
my
do know
earlier
that
statement
there
about-
was a value.
That's just
in
the basin.
DRBC regulations, I think what the number that came to mind was something like 8 cents per 1,000
Right,
gallons.
it's just
or
the
something
basin.
like-
I think it
and that-
seems that
that
the
seemed
towns and the villages and the hamlets and whomever has
Your
taxation
point,
issues needs to
your
look
point
at
though, Liz, is absolutely well taken, that, that if water is contaminated on a large scale, the value of water is gonna increase astronomically, and we could be, fighting each other for water.
We only have about 10 more minutes in the room, so let's get the rest of the commission's questions answered.
Can you talk about a little bit what other towns similar to us in size may be seeing as far as sales tax? Well, county, is there a big increase with sales tax?
Oh, you
When-
mean like in Pennsylvania where they're
Yeah,
drilling?
yeah.
I haven't seen anything on sales tax. Let me look for some stuff. I'll send it to you if I find something.
I was so done.
That paper done that I mentioned, that talked about tax revenue that they haven't seen, may mention sales tax, I just don't remember. So if I get you that
Okay.
paper, what?
This white paper
No,
you were
no,
talking
the-
about from the
no,
Valorem
no,
tax?
the paper done in Pennsylvania. The white paper was Tompkins County, New York, about.
Yeah,
about-
was this Harry Levine? I think it was.
Oh, I don't know who wrote it. But the sales tax, all I'm saying is that a paper where I mentioned that, I said that the research in Pennsylvania that concluded that most local governments being affected by shale gas development are not seeing more tax revenue as a result. That paper may have something on sales tax, so I'm sending that to you, so when I send it to you,
Okay, that would
you'll
be,
see it. Okay.
and if you can include as many sources as possible, that would be
Okay.
really helpful.
There was also some discussion about multipliers, a review study from, in a review study submitted by Tom, was unanswered questions about economic impact of gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale. Don't jump to conclusions. How do you feel? I don't really see a question here, but there's,
We
do
can
the
talk about
multipliers, do the multipliers hold up for oil? Is gas drilling a good multiplier?
Well, I mean, I just told you that West Virginia is not seeing an increase in employment, so it doesn't sound like the gas drilling there has a very high multiplier. We know that that the oil and gas industry is approximately 10 times more capital intensive than the average American industry. By capital intensive, it means it uses relatively more capital and relatively less labor. An industry that is very capital intensive, by definition, uses much less labor and therefore is likely to have a much lower employment multiplier, for example. One thing you have to be aware of, if you go and search like online for oil and gas multipliers, you get a wide range. The oil and gas multipliers that you've seen quoted lately, I just saw one of the recent studies by IHS Global Insight. They've done a lot of economic studies. They have a high multiplier. But what people don't realize is that IHS Global Insight has been hired by America's Natural Gas Alliance to do the study. So they're going to come up with a high multiplier. The other thing is...
But they have to sort of back it up, you know? I mean, if it's-
Well, they use the technique, they typically use input-output analysis in these things, which is the same technique, the same methodology that the industry-funded studies are using. And there are a lot of problems with input-output analysis, and it usually ends up overstating the multiplier. I have a whole technical lecture I could give you on input-output analysis. In fact, it's in one of my papers, which I'll send you, some of the problems with input-output analysis. But those cause exaggerated multipliers. So when you hear people throwing around multipliers, most of them are from these industry-sponsored studies, and that's really quite a big concern. And of course, you're all aware that the gas industry has a lot of money. I mean, and they buy advertising, they buy PR. They lobby. They make political contributions. They buy economic impact studies. And a lot of economists that are producing these things are working for these major economic consulting firms. And some of their largest clients are oil and gas companies. So they're going to be, maybe they'll be inflated.
Well, what would you recommend for the oil and gas company to do if not employ somebody to have it done? You gotta come up with an answer somehow.
I think that the DEC should be hiring independent people to do this work so that we get independent.
That's a separate entity altogether in the state, in this state.
Right.
Now, there was a fellow just here, well, one of the nights when we come home from one of these meetings, it was about a month or so ago. He was employed by the DEC and retired from the mineral department of New York State. He didn't have a bit of problem with this thing. Not a bit. And when he started stating how many wells are already drilled in New York State and the regulations that's been in effect since 1984, kind of makes you wonder if what we're doing here now is as sensible as what I think. Because this has been going on a long time.
Nobody has
We're the
told
ones
you.
that's behind. But I
Nobody.
agree with you, if there's a problem, let's get it fixed before we end up with
Right,
a problem.
right.
How do we put the regulations in order?
Has nobody told you how the current technology is different than the technology that was done before?
Oh, certainly, I just got one here, I just read here the other
So
day.
you can't even compare the
No,
impacts.
you're right, you're 100% right.
So
Exactly.
what this guy's saying
And
is
you
wrong.
can't compare the leases with the old leases either.
Right.
You know, because if they didn't negotiate the old lease, which was a poor lease to begin with, people went into it blind. Yes, there was problems. If you go into a lease, negotiated lease now, knowing what the problems are, it should be a whole lot better. And that's where we're headed if we wait.
Frankly, we don't have enough information yet, so we should
Fracking
definitely
is a
wait.
new
Exactly.
technology, and all the wells that have been going on out western state are not horizontally drilled. That's the difference now.
And they don't
The
use the same
chemicals
quantities
is
of
what we're
chemicals.
talking about, and the disruption in a different manner and form. It's not the same as just drilling for oil. If it was that simple, it would have been done 75 years ago when they started drilling for oil.
I
It's the
just said that-
fracking, that's the question.
Fracking, the horizontal stuff didn't start till 2005. But the point is, if I'm gonna go buy a washing machine, I'm not gonna read what Westinghouse has to say about their washing machine. I'm not even gonna read what Consumer Reports has to say. I'm not even going to what GE says. I'm gonna go to talk to people who've used these kind of machines. What's the user actually saying? What's the experience? And part of the problem, I agree, we've got conflicting reports. I mean, there are people down in Fort Worth, Texas, even though there was a gigantic, crater blown out in Fort Worth, Texas, there are people who still think it's a really good thing.
But there are other people in Fort Worth who don't think it's a good thing.
Right. And wherever you go, but the bottom line is we have to talk to each other about it, not to the industry that wants us to do it, because every single time we look, when they've assured us but there hasn't been oversight, they didn't do the right thing. It's not in their interest to do the right thing. It's in their interest to make money and to satisfy their shareholders. And so they pay a nominal fine, and off they go. We have to have, as she's saying, we have to have the DEC doing this. We have to have somebody who's actually committed to our interests. And if you believe that about the DEC, okay.
I'm not so sure they are, right?
I mean, on some level, it's just common sense who you listen to.
Yes.
Go ahead. It's
Well,
the
I think
question.
we have to wrap up, so I just wanted to ask if you could, I'll give you the information, and if you could get back to us with some of the sources, and especially those points you talked about in the beginning.
Well, Jannette, I would like to ask if you'd come back, or I think we could use it for another session if you're willing to
I would come back, but do I have like 2 more minutes?
Yes,
Because
yes.
I want you all, you're probably not all gonna sit down and read these regs, but there's some things that you should know that are in these regs. The DEC, in their recently proposed high-volume hydraulic fracturing regs, mention costs to local governments. This is what you need to know. And they include additional paperwork requirements for waste tracking, permitting, and testing, emergency response activities, costs associated with road maintenance. We didn't even get into road maintenance. They say that local governments may want to proactively retain professional services to assist with emergency response and traffic control. They say there will be cost impacts to county health departments who respond to complaints about water quality, and they say these costs cannot be quantified. I don't think that's true. They should be able to quantify these. The regulations state that local governments will have to monitor operators and owners in the fracking process to ensure the health, safety, and the environment are adequately protected. So the DEC is pushing much of the cost of safety monitoring onto local governments. This will be very expensive for communities. It looks like we're not going to, at $600 per well in tax revenue, it looks like we're not going to have the money to pay for this stuff. Furthermore, the DEC has not estimated any of these costs, and they've ignored some other costs, some of which I've told you before, about things like declining other industries, the crowding out issue, the cost of the long-term bust. They don't mention any of this. The real possibility of declines in property values and property tax revenues. The DEC doesn't mention that at all. Nobody mentions the fact that if we have a vast network of pipelines, gathering lines, transmission lines, larger pipelines, what does that mean for development and building going forward in our communities? You can't build close to a pipeline, so it ruins much of the area for future development. Do we want that? I mean, I think there's a lot that has to happen here. We have to go back to the drawing board. There's a lot more research that has to be done before we accept any of this in any of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you just that would be wonderful. It was off the secretary too, so it's like.